Good evening, everybody. How are you all doing? Very good? Good, good. Welcome to HubSpot. For anybody that hasn't been here before, there's a few familiar faces lurking around, but welcome to everybody else that hasn't actually made it in here before. My name is Barbara McCarthy. I'm the Director of Engineering here in Dublin, for anybody that doesn't know me. And we're thrilled to have Eric Richard over from our Cambridge office to do this talk tonight. One of the things that I suppose from a company perspective, we're very well renowned for is our product. I think the other thing that we're very well renowned for as a company is our amazing positive culture and our work environment. We are always asked as to how does that work specifically from an engineering perspective, and how do we think about how we set our teams up for success in terms of being the most effective, most productive teams. And I'm really looking forward to Eric's talk tonight because he'll get into a lot of that detail, and I hope you'll take some inspiration from it. So just to call out one more thing before I hand over to Eric. So after the talk tonight, we're actually going to head, it's really exciting for us. We've just opened our brand new product space here in Dublin. So obviously we are aiming for huge expansion and great things. And we're going to actually walk you guys over to that new space to have a drink afterwards. So you're actually the first external visitors to be able to see our brand new space, which we just moved into on Monday. So don't get the impression you're going to sneak away early because you'll miss out big time. Okay? Well, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Eric. Thanks you very much.
Howdy, Ren. And just in case, ooh, I'm really loud. Just in case you're wondering, the walk is like a 3-minute walk. It's like downstairs. So we're not walking across the city. So here's a little bit of kind of the agenda, what we'll walk through. We'll do a little bit of an introduction, saying a little bit of context about HubSpot, about what the problems are we're trying to solve in this conversation. Probably the bulk of the conversation will be about how at HubSpot we kind of work, how do things work here, how have we set things up, talking through a couple of different angles there, things we really focus on. Spend a little bit of time talking about kind of the pros and cons, what we've seen really work there, some of the challenges that we have with that. Dive into really short a couple of case studies of very specific things that we started to do in terms of how we think about kind of really optimizing for the pros and cons. And then my favorite part of this is really the Q&A. So hopefully this is really all the appetizer for that part. So as we're going through here, my real hope is that it engages you guys thinking, you ask some interesting questions, we can really have a discussion here. I think this part is what's going to make this hopefully an amazing night. So please, as you go through, be thinking of your questions. So I want to start off with really kind of almost a caveat, which is we're going to spend a whole bunch of time here talking about how HubSpot engineering works. And I'm obviously pretty biased. I think it works really well. But I don't want this to come across like we're trying to brag about things. And I want to really acknowledge that we're not blazing the trail out there and doing something that no one else has done. There's really a couple of companies that really have inspired HubSpot and that we really try to live up to. So the first one is we happen to have a really good relationship with the VP of Engineering over at Facebook, and each year get to spend some time with him, learning how Facebook is organized, learning how they've kind of scaled over time and grown, and really kind of draw a lot of inspiration from how Facebook engineering works. A second one is if anybody's seen the Spotify videos about how they work, I'd say about 80% of those videos really translates very, very directly over to HubSpot. We think that there's a lot of really interesting models that they've thought of. We regularly take a page out of their book about how to run an engineering organization. And then the third one is Inside the Plex. So this is really a reference to Google. When I first joined the company, when I first joined HubSpot, I read Inside the Plex. And as I was reading the book, I thought it was the best description of HubSpot's culture that I'd ever found, and it's a book about Google. And that's because, again, HubSpot really tries to model itself after folks like Google. So this is really kind of a testament to there's a lot of other companies out there that we're trying to draw from, trying to learn from. And another piece here is, as we go through and talk about this, a lot of the challenges about how to kind of design an engineering culture, how to have an engineering team run, there is no right answer. I'm going to walk you through kind of what we've decided on. But there's a bunch of pros and cons. There's trade-offs. No system that you design doesn't have trade-offs. So I think a lot of this is really about the questions that kind of goes back to the Q&A part at the end. So really, hopefully, as you're listening to my talk here, hopefully you're thinking about well, gosh, like, how would that work? And what's the trade-off here? And why is that the choice that you guys have made? I also don't profess that this is the right approach for all companies. I'll talk about that in another slide. So, formal introduction, I'm Eric. I'm the VP of Engineering here. I have been at HubSpot for just over 4 years. During that time, HubSpot's product team has grown from about 70 people to about 450 people. Our Dublin product team has grown from about 6 people to about 80 people during that time. And one of the things that we've really focused on is how do you, when I came in, we had a fantastic engineering culture in a small organization. I think one of the biggest challenges that I've really faced is how you keep that culture as you scale and how do you kind of accelerate that. So a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight are those sorts of things about how do you kind of keep that set up for scale. So we're going to spend a bunch of time talking about the HubSpot product team and how we create a remarkable culture, how we get our product managers and designers and engineers to all look that happy. So a little bit of context, not to do a sell job on you about HubSpot, but for you to have context about who we are, the problems we're trying to solve. So this is a slide, kind of the standard boilerplate slide on who HubSpot is. There's really one line here that I think, for me, is the one that's really important. And it's that we really focus on solving for small and medium-sized businesses. The reason why I think that's important is that if we were solving for banks, if we were solving for healthcare, if we were solving for large Fortune 100 or Global 100 companies, I bet that a bunch of the things that I talk about here wouldn't apply. They wouldn't be appropriate, or they'd be much harder to really solve for. When you have 35,000 customers and they're mostly small customers, it actually gives us a lot of freedom and flexibility in terms of how we organize the engineering team. So this is kind of one of those pieces of there is no right solutions. This is the right one for us, and it happens to be related to the market that we're trying to solve and the constraints that we have. Other companies have different constraints, and the solutions might not be right for them. As Barbara mentioned, one of the things that HubSpot's been known for over time has really been our investment in culture. And it's not just kind of us who stands up in there and says that. There have been a number of different kind of outside organizations who have rated HubSpot. We won Glassdoor's Best Places to Work, the Fortune 100 Best Companies to Work For. This one is really exciting. Last year is the first time we ever saw a ranking of Dublin or Ireland organizations. And so HubSpot came in number 2 in terms of Irish tech companies to work for. And this last one over here is very new. There's a new company out that's basically a competitor to Glassdoor that goes through and rates companies on a lot of different places. So hopefully we're doing a few things right to really create a culture for our employees. I'm going to talk a little bit about the HubSpot product team, and mostly to set up for how we kind of organize ourselves and have things work. So as I mentioned, we basically have 2 main offices. We have our Boston office and we have our Dublin office. The Boston office is, call it about 300-ish people, 350 people. The Dublin office is about 80 people, so you can kind of see the split there. Inside, when I talk about our product team, it really is a multifunctional team. So we have our designers, we have our engineers, we have our product managers all working together inside of that. So throughout tonight, as I talk about the organization, we're really talking about those functions together. It's not just purely an engineering-driven discussion. Let me dive into kind of how we work, and there's going to be 3 real pillars that I talk about here. One of the things, for those who haven't seen it yet, HubSpot produced what we call the Culture Code. This is one of our founders, Dharmesh Shah, published the Culture Code. For those who have also seen the Netflix Culture Code, this was really inspired by the Netflix Culture Code. And it really tries to lay out who we are as a company, what we really believe in. And I hope that anybody who's read it, one of the questions you probably have is like, is this real? Like, how much of this is just aspirational versus how much of this is like real? And I think if you asked any of the HubSpotters, we would tell you, like, we really try to live by this. That doesn't mean we're perfect. There's a lot of the ideas in here that are very aspirational. But if you want to really understand more about the HubSpot culture, like, go check out the Culture Code. I think it really kind of talks through the details and the philosophy of HubSpot. But for me, this is really, if I have to distill our product team's culture down into one slide, this is the one that I always come back to. And it really leads to a lot of what we're going to talk about here. It's this idea that if you give a team a compelling mission, you give the team that autonomy to attack that mission as they see fit and the support to accomplish it, just magical things can happen. So like I said, I've been at HubSpot for 4 years. I've seen multiple times where these magical things have happened, where teams have just been able to move at ridiculously fast paces, accomplish amazing things, and you really just see them operating at an entirely different level. So when I think about my job is really to try to create a system, a world in which teams are most likely to succeed here. My job is to set teams up for success so that magic can happen. I'll give an example of one of the magic happens moments that happened last fall. So one of the pieces of the HubSpot product is we have a website hosting platform. So our customers can host their websites on our product. And last fall, I think it was an October timeframe, a September timeframe, Google had announced that they were going to, in Chrome, that they were going to start putting up warnings for any website that wasn't hosted over SSL that had a form on it. If you know anything about HubSpot, a huge part of our methodology and our customers' method, what they're trying to do is they have forms on their website to collect information. So we're hosting their websites, they have forms on their websites. Chrome is about to start putting warnings on any website that isn't SSL hosted. We've been for a long time trying to get more and more of our customers to move over to SSL. It's been a multi-year initiative. Hard. Most of our customers aren't that technical, so trying to get them to make DNS changes is a hard thing. Trying to get all the whole SSL provisioning thing working is very difficult. So we'd been pushing along on that for a couple of years, and then it came out that Chrome, this version of Chrome was going to release in 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, all of our customers' websites were going to start getting warnings on them. So our dev team got together and they said, well, is there anything that we can do? And we talked about a bunch of different options that we could go through. And then we said, well, what if we provisioned every single one of our customers' websites with SSL in the next 3 weeks? The team scratched their head and said, well, this is a problem we've been working on for 2 years. Sure, sounds like fun. So we set out to try to figure out how to solve this in 3 weeks. And then we got the next update from Google that it actually wasn't 3 weeks, it was basically about a week away. So the team had to figure out how to do this over the course of a week. They did it. They wound up migrating, I think it was about 60,000 of our customers' production websites over, SSL enabling them in about 10 days, got out there before that Chrome update hit. And when I was watching this entire thing, I realized that my job was just to stand back, get out of the way, and let the team work because the magic was happening. And you saw it at the end. It was just amazing what they were able to do. And that's just one example of kind of where success comes out of when you can set a team up for success in the right environment. So here are really the three kind of philosophies that we'll dive into here, giving around kind of thinking around HubSpot thinks about things. So the first one is really learning quickly. Second one is this idea that ownership creates better products. And the third one is really investing in the platform. So we'll go through each one of these in turn. So learning quickly. Really, you can think about this. This is the same thing as kind of lean development. This is the same thing as a lot of the companies that try to get out there, prototype early, learn quickly. We have a motto in the company that we use a lot. Actually, this is painted on one of the walls in our Cambridge office called Ship It. And Ship It is really this idea that code that is sitting on your laptop is not providing value. It's this idea that you could take the best product manager, the best designer, the best engineering team in the world, you could put them into a room, they could come up with the best idea on how to solve a customer's problem, create the best implementation, and I can almost guarantee you that when they put that out in production, it'd be wrong. And the reason why I say that is because understanding customers is nearly impossible. You can't figure them out every single curve, every single edge case. And the best way to figure out the customers is to get the software in front of them. So Ship It is this idea that our best thing we can do is get ideas out there and get feedback from our customers and iterate off that. That doesn't mean ship it out to all 40,000 of our customers at once and like overwhelm them with change and stuff like that. It's like, how do you get that out to a single customer? How do you get that out to 10 customers? How do you get it out to a beta of customers? Get feedback from them and iterate very quickly. So okay, so if you had this idea that you wanted to have an engineering organization or a product organization where you wanted to have rapid iteration, a lot of learning in there, what are the things that would really be necessary? The first one, and this is something that we've really been investing in a lot more recently, is a UX research team. So part of our product team is UX researchers. These are folks who are trained in how do you really understand the needs of a customer. They have a very kind of scientific approach to working with customers, getting prototypes in front of them, trying to understand what is the actual pain they're feeling, trying to understand how they're interacting with a particular solution. And that allows us to really vet ideas very quickly. So rather than having a development team having to go and build out an entire implementation, get the right idea out there first, use prototypes, use mocks, get feedback on that, and you can really save time in the long term. A second one, and we'll talk about this a couple of times during the talk, is really minimizing distance between the keyboard and production. So one of the things, all of our engineers, when they start, they go through an onboarding project. And one of the things that we teach them is how easy it is to ship into production. Our job, our infrastructure team's job, is to really get everything that we can out of the way between them having an idea, them being able to write a line of code, and getting out into production. So that, we'll talk in a little bit about what that means, but it really changes your philosophy of how do you move quickly if you can move relatively quickly and get things out in production, get things in front of customers. And I alluded to this a second ago. The third thing is if you can then do targeted deploys to customers. So we're a SaaS company. There's effectively a single instance of HubSpot in the world. All of our customers are using that single instance of HubSpot, but we have controls in there that allow a developer to make it really easy to say, hey, I only want this code to go out to certain sets of customers. So I can have an idea, I can go through the UX research team, prove out that that's the right idea, I can push that out to production very quickly, and I can target that to a set of customers, and through that it really lets me learn about how that works. Are they using it? Are they using it in the way they thought? Watching how they use it and interact with it. There's a couple of technology implications, though, that are needed in order to make that happen. The first one is we've really spent a lot of time on efficient build and deploy tools. So again, going back to that minimized kind of the distance between your keyboard and production, how do you make it so that you can shave off tens of seconds off of a build? When we have a team of 300 developers, 10 minutes on a build across 300 developers, each of which who are all trying to do builds, like that's a lot of time. So everything we can do to really optimize that, to the point we actually, for a long time, we're a Jenkins shop. We actually, a couple of years ago, wrote our own build system primarily to try to increase the efficiency, narrow down how fast it is that we can get those builds out, really optimized for our use case. So just as an example of that, we have about 5,000 production deploys per week. Doesn't mean that we're shipping out massively huge new features 5,000 times a week. What I think that really points to is it points to a philosophy of being able to ship very, very, very quickly and small. So if you want to make a really, really simple change and get it out there all the time, it really narrows how far you are off of master. It means that your change that you're putting in is could very well be like 3 lines to fix a bug fix. And now all of a sudden, like the concepts of things like, well, what's the big merge look like? There is no big merge. And when you go and push that out into production, there's no side effects of, well, I have to worry about what this person did or that person did, because there's just my 3 lines of code that changed, and so I can look and see whether that worked. I can go look and see whether anything else broke. I don't have to think about all of that other stuff that's been going on for the last month. I really just have a change that's this big. So a couple of the anti-patterns, and we've kind of alluded to this. So the first one is the long-lived branches that have a big distance from the trunk. So just kind of talked about that notion. Avoiding that big merge, avoiding that moment where you have, a month's worth of my team's changes and a month's worth of your team's changes coming together and trying to figure out, well, how do those two things interact with one another? And then figuring out when you push out that month's worth of 2 teams' changes together, when you push that out, well, how do you figure out what the heck is causing problems? The second one is the monolithic code base that's shared across multiple teams. So when you're trying to move quickly, having that monolithic code base, it just gets in each other's way. We were not always this way. Only a handful of years ago, that content system that I mentioned, our website hosting platform, it was a monolithic Django application. And I remember teams getting to the point where team A would make a change, check something in, kick off a build. When you have a monolithic application, it also tends to take a longer time to build. So they would do the build. The build would take, I don't remember what it was, 20, 30, 40 minutes. They'd run the tests on that. It was a large application, so the test took a long time to run. So they'd run all the tests. And maybe like an hour later, they'd come back with a failure because something was wrong in there. So they'd go fix whatever was going wrong. And while they were doing that, team B, who's working on the same code base, would check in their change, whatever they were working on. Their build would kick off. Their build would fail because of whatever team A was doing. So they have to wait for team A's fix to come in, get team A's fix in, and by the time they fixed that, what you realize is that team B had a problem. You got into a point where teams couldn't get builds out there. They couldn't get deploys out. There were times there where those teams were taking 24 hours or so to try to get some piece of code out there because they were just stepping on each other. And really the solution in that particular case for us was to really break up that monolithic code base, get each team having their own code, where the primary value there is now all of a sudden I don't have to worry about like whatever you're doing. If you're breaking your code, that's fine. And you're not breaking my code, I can move really quickly. So the second real philosophy that we've really leaned into is this idea that ownership builds better products. This idea that if an engineering team feels like they own what they're building, that they're going to have a self-interest in making that the best product possible. So this is a quote I found from Steve Jobs that I thought was really appropriate. Just the idea that you don't hire smart people and then tell them what to do. You hire the smart people so they can tell us what to do. I think it's really true. Even when we're hiring people straight out of college, a lot of them they're going to know the problem that they're in way better than I'm going to know the problem space that they're in. So making sure that they have the autonomy to really make decisions about what's the best way to solve that. So in our world, we basically divide all of that 400 engineers, that 400 people in product that I mentioned, we divide those into teams. Every team is basically a 5-person unit. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And really for that team, you can think about our 400 people as being made up of these units of different teams, so each of these teams. A team is cross-disciplinary, so those 5 people, that includes a product manager, a designer, a tech lead, and a few engineers. And teams own their entire stack. They own the front end, they own the back end. They also own the entire life cycle for that. The way we tend to do this is vertical slices of the product. So you can basically say, my team owns this feature set of the product. I tend to own a particular persona. I own a particular problem that persona is trying to solve. My team owns solving for that. They own that from cradle to grave. So what I mean by that is they own figuring out, well, how are we going to solve that persona's problem? Like, are we going to go build some new features? If so, like, what are those new features? Do we need to improve the usability? Maybe what we're getting is feedback that the usability is poor, or maybe we're getting feedback that the performance is poor, or maybe we're getting feedback that it's buggy. So like, what is the problem that we're going to solve? How are we going to solve it? How are we going to prioritize that? All of those decisions are basically made locally at the team level. It's not my job, it's not Barbara's job, it's not our peers' job to tell the team how they're going to solve the problems. It's the team's job to figure that out. They own implementing that. They own running that through the beta process. They own pushing that into production. They own managing that after it's in production. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. So we have what we often internally refer to as the Trinity or the Triad. We have the product manager, we have the tech lead, and the product designer. I think from places that I've been at before, one of the real differences that we've tried to put in place is this is really a team of co-equals. There's no single person in this triad that is dominating or running the team. Each of those 3 are working together to try to figure out what the best solution is. Now, each of them has a different perspective. They're coming with a different expertise. They're coming with a different perspective on things. So obviously the product manager kind of is going to be better at understanding where should we be going? What are the specific problems we should be trying to solve? The tech lead, they have a tremendous understanding of the code base, the ways that you can get there, how to get there, and really kind of expert there. And the designer you can think of as kind of the advocate for the customer of how we get there. But no single person in here is telling the others what to do. It's really a kind of a co-equal system. The counter example that I've seen in my career is when you have basically engineering teams and the PM who's their boss. The PM tells the engineers, this is what you're going to do. The engineers go do that, and regardless of whether they think it's a good idea or not. And oftentimes what you get is PM hands a mandate down to the engineers. The engineers say, I don't really think this is a good idea, but I'm going to do it anyways. You release that, it turns out to be crap, and the engineer's like, I knew it all the time, and it's never going to work. That's not ownership. They're not really engaged in making a successful product. So what we really want to do is make sure that all 3 parts of the solution here are thinking about how to build the best product for our customers. So what are some of the things that we try to avoid? I mentioned that our kind of standard team is around 5, 6, 7, somewhere around there. We absolutely try to avoid large teams. So there's probably some breaking point. My guess is probably 7 is on the high side. If you showed me one of my teams and it had 10 people, I'd say it's probably too big. And it creates a lot of friction. It gets back to that, well, how do you make sure that all those pieces are working well together? How do you communicate across all those people? So we really try to keep the team sizes small so that you can really focus on the problem at hand. The way that I often try to talk about it is Ideally, your team is the person to your right, the person to your left, the person sitting over from you. And like to communicate as a team, it really is just kind of like talking about to the people right around you. The second that you need to go into a conference room to have a team meeting to talk about what you're doing, probably means the team is getting a bit big. A second one, and this one is maybe more controversial. We don't have separate QA. We don't have separate IT or separate DevOps. The teams own everything. So what does that mean? That means the teams are responsible for the quality. It's not some other organization's job to make sure that the code works. It's your job to make sure the code works. There's no team that is doing builds and deploys for you. There's no team that is got a pager that's going to get paged at night if your problem goes wrong. You have the pager. And the real philosophy there is if you check in something at 5 o'clock on a Friday night, why is it that somebody else in some other organization is getting paged at 2 a.m. on a Saturday to wake up and fix that? It's your fault. So really quickly create that accountability. So accountability and ownership kind of being two pieces of the same puzzle. And the third one, if there's really no sustaining engineering, we don't have another team, we don't have low-cost offshore team that you say, hey, they're the ones who do sustaining engineering. The team does sustaining engineering. The team fixes its own bugs. Again, this is kind of same variation of the last one, which is clean up your own mess. Like if you're creating a bunch of bugs out there, then you're the one who's going to get to fix them. And I think I've never once, and I don't think Barbara has ever had to tell an engineer it's probably a bad idea to ship a large change at 5 p.m. on Friday night right before you head out to the pub. Why? Because they learn that lesson themselves really fast. And so we don't have to put in rules. We don't have to put in guardrails. It's like, hey, do whatever you want. If you want your phone to start buzzing while you're at the pub, like, you can do that. People really quickly learn that's probably not the world they want. So what are kind of the technology implications of everything that we just talked about for this section? The first one, and this was probably something that I wasn't here when they got this in place, and I think this is a key part of the magic. So if you have teams that are having to own their entire stack, if you have teams that are owning their front end, they're owning their back end, they're owning the operational systems, they're owning getting paged at the middle of the night, the only way that I think you can do that is if you've really deeply invested it in the underlying infrastructure and made it stable. Because the flip side of what I said before is also true. If you have your devs and they're carrying pager and they're getting paged at 2 a.m. because the MySQL server went down or because there was a network blip or because a piece of hardware fell over, they're going to be pretty pissed. So you can only get to the point where you hand them that pager when you basically say, it ain't the infrastructure's fault. You're not going to get paged for something that isn't your fault. The only reason you're going to get paged is because of code that you wrote. So a large part of this is infrastructure to help. A second piece of this, and we'll talk about this as well, is help giving them a lot of tooling and technology to allow them to move faster. So I'll give an example here. We run an Amazon. We've run an Amazon since basically the company was founded. And for anybody who works in Amazon, you'll know stuff fails. So right now, one of our servers is probably failing. So how do you have a team not get paged when all of a sudden one of their servers is failing? The first is we've created a lot of resiliency in the system that the team isn't even aware of. So we actually are running Mesos on top of Amazon. So our teams actually don't even know when an underlying Amazon host disappears. Mesos takes that away from them. They don't have to think about it. In addition, let's say a MySQL server fails. Well, the good news is we made it really easy for teams to auto-provision clusters of servers with master, multiple slaves, replicate it all set up. Like they don't have to be DBAs to know how to do that. We've created tooling that, like, without them thinking, they know how to make that work. We've also created tooling so that monitoring is automatically enabled on that. Alerting is automatically enabled. They get automatically notified if something's going wrong, if there's a large lag. They don't have to be experts in monitoring to figure that out. But sometimes some things go wrong that you do need a human to get involved with. So for example, if it happens to be that one of the masters falls over, again, let's assume that an Amazon instance goes down, the MySQL master falls over there, someone's got to go in and do a master-slave swap there, promote one of the slaves up to master, and get that going. Again, we don't want that team to have to be MySQL experts and understand how to do all that. So the first thing that we did is we basically made this a push button feature for them. If you get paged at 2 a.m. and you wind up figuring out that your master just fell over, you log in, you go to a website, you hit a button, and it does the swap for you. But the next question we thought is, well, why do you have to do that? Why can't we have the technology do that ourselves? So we're in the process right now of doing another technology overhaul where we really want to get to the point that essentially our MySQL systems can be auto-healing so that if the master goes down, then the master-slave swap happens automatically and that person doesn't have to get up and push that button. That's the sort of infrastructure that I'm talking about that allows the dev teams to own large swaths of area, have a lot of footprint without basically having them get completely overwhelmed and allowing them to focus on really delivering customer value. One of the other things that's interesting, it's interesting to me when I came to HubSpot, is when you walk into HubSpot, if you ask anybody here, so what's your engineering methodology? What's your process? I've been a VP of engineering at multiple other companies, and I could tell you what processes they use. HubSpot, when someone asks me that question, I go like, I don't know. We're not a Scrum shop. We're not a Kanban shop. We're not like, there's no single methodology that we profess. Now, I would tell you that there are teams who use Kanban boards here. There are teams that use Scrum-like elements here. But it's something that really is fit for the team. Each team, going back to what I said before, each team kind of has the autonomy to figure it out themselves. They're allowed to figure out whatever process works for them. It's not process for us, it's process for them. What we do is provide them with the kind of very high-level goals and guardrails of where we need the business to go, what are the general things that are acceptable and what are the general things that are not acceptable, and then really let them figure out, well, what processes should work for them. I saw this quote in Jeff Bezos' last letter to the shareholders. I thought it was really good because I think this is actually relatively typical. That happens in a lot of engineering cultures. I've certainly seen it happen at previous companies I've been in, which is where process becomes a thing in of itself. Process becomes the end to itself. That you forget about why you're putting in process, and you kind of forget about the outcomes. And so I think one of our real things we've tried to focus on is focus on the outcomes, focus on delivering value to the customer. I don't care what process a team is using. All I care about is, are they getting the job done? They can do whatever they want. So the last kind of real pillar that I wanted to talk about is this idea of investing in the platform. We alluded to a little bit before. So about 20% of all of our engineers are on what we call our platform infrastructure team. Their customer is the rest of our developers. So 80% of our team is writing code for our customers. 20% of our team is writing code for our developers. Easy to think about this as like RailEng. So for most other companies, like a release engineering team. Things like doing ops, those sorts of things, DBAs. Except there's one real big difference. None of the people that we have in our infrastructure teams are what I call system admins. They're all developers. Every single one of them writes code every single day. They're software engineers. They could actually be working on our product teams. And what they're creating is they're creating software for the rest of our teams. So build and deploy kind of makes sense. They create a lot of our core Java libraries, so there's a lot of really interesting things that we do at the base level of our software that we don't want our product teams to have to think about. We want them to just get it for free. UI component library, we'll actually talk about this in a couple of slides. And a ton of tooling. So I mentioned the tooling to manage things like HBase. Our teams do really interesting things with HBase, with MySQL, with Kafka, Elasticsearch. We don't want our teams to have to be experts in all of those, but we also don't want to have operations people who are managing that for them. So we really focus on is creating tooling for our teams so that they can effectively manage HBase without having to be an HBase guru. I think one of the really keys here is almost how we think about those teams. We don't think about this 20% of our engineers as a cost center. This isn't a, oh man, like let's try to figure out how can we get leverage out of the cost center by reducing the size of it over time. Instead, we look at it as a leverage center, that I look at these 20% of people as people who are making my other 80% of engineers more effective. They're making it so that their builds go faster. They're making it so that we're upgrading from Java 7. This team is the team that upgraded all of our entire application from Java 7 to Java 8 basically over a couple of months. This is the team that's creating massive libraries that all of our teams build on top of. These people create efficiencies and leverage for all of the rest of my developers. And really, in the end of the day, I think helps The rest of our developers feel like they're focusing on, I get to come in every day and just focus on building product. I don't have to worry about all of this stuff underneath me. One of the things, and this goes into the there is no right answer, what I just described really only works at scale. So when you have 300 engineers, you can actually have a bunch of engineers focused on getting efficiency and then multiply that times 300, and it actually makes mathematical sense and works out. If you have a relatively small dev team, it's hard to argue how you get mathematical leverage out of that because the multiplier isn't large enough. So for us, this is something that kind of makes sense, but I think it took a while for us to hit that point where it really made sense. We've really deeply invested in this in the last 3 or 4 years. Before then, it was a very, very small crew. So I'm going to walk through a few kind of the pros and cons of everything that we talked about here, what we've seen work, what we think hasn't worked so well, and then talk about some use cases of places that we've really invested to try to make things work well. So one of the things we absolutely see is teams that can really have very high velocity, teams that can develop new products very, very quickly, get to market very, very quickly, push code. So I mentioned this earlier that all of our developers try to push code, and goal is to have them pushing code into production on their first day. So have systems in place that allow them to do that. So allow teams to move very, very quickly. I think really the key value that I see is feeling like tremendous ownership of their code, feeling like they own their area. I think there's a lot of team pride. There's pride around like, I'm on the blog team or I'm on the email team. This is my thing. I think they have personal investment in what they're building. There's also a lot of freedom to experiment with new technologies. So on one hand, we try to really focus in on our core platform. So you've seen a bunch of the technologies we use, Java, HBase, MySQL, et cetera. But we also don't constrain teams to those technologies. If I was standing here 3 years ago, I think, we had 0 Kafka in our environment. If I was standing here 2 years ago, we had 0 Elasticsearch in our environment. We had 0 React in our environment. Today, Kafka, Elasticsearch, React, these are fundamental components of our environment. Those things didn't become fundamental components of our environment because I said so, because Barbara said so, because our chief architect said so. They became core elements of our system because some team said, hey, you know what? I've got a business problem. And I think that Kafka is a better solution than HBase, or I think Elasticsearch is a better solution than HBase, or I think that React is a better solution than Backbone. And we gave them freedom to let them go and experiment with that. And they succeeded. And then they stood up and they told the rest of the organization, hey, like there's this new technology out called Kafka. Let me explain to you. Let me explain how I'm using it and see how you can use it. And then they started propagating that throughout the rest of the organization. And at some point, we said, hey, like this has now actually become a main core piece of our system. Let's move, going back to the platform side, let's move responsibility for a lot of that tooling into the platform infra team where we can have a couple of experts who like deeply understands this. But I think that freedom really allows teams to feel like they're not constrained in terms of how they solve the problems. We kind of alluded to this as well, but I think there's a very strong sense of accountability in terms of, okay, I know that if I mess things up, I'm going to be the one that's going to pay the price, not someone else. So where's this hard? This whole small autonomous teams, lots of microservices, where does it get hard? Where are the places that we struggle with and the teams struggle with? Clearly, the biggest one, and this one is something that we spend a lot of our energy on. It's probably one of the things that we spend our most energy on because our system is almost aligned against this, is cross-cutting initiatives. So when I came in, the first project that I was responsible for was internationalizing our product. When you have, at the time it's probably 15 teams or 20 teams, how do you do something that's horizontal like that? Or how do you do a major reskinning of our entire application? Those are really hard because our organization is not set up for horizontal things. Our organization is set up for lots of independence and lots of autonomy. What we've actually found is that the way that we've tended to solve these cross-cutting initiatives is actually by almost refactoring them and turning cross-cutting initiatives into 30, 40, 50 separate individual instances of the problem. So just as an example, when I came in and was doing the internationalization project, my first instinct was, great, like what we'll do is we will internationalize the app, right? This is like one thing that you do. You internationalize the entire app. We'll like go through that whole project and we will release the internationalized app. And someone sat me down and was like, no, that's not how we're going to do it. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, what we're going to do So we're going to do 40 projects that are app internationalization. We're going to internationalize every single one of them, and we're going to internationalize them separately. It's like, well, when are you going to be done? Like, well, when all 40 of them are done. When the 40th one is done, that's when you're done. Well, what's that going to be like from a user experience perspective? Well, we can put this behind the gate. We can make it so that no one sees this. We can make it so that people who opt in can see this. And it's like, well, why would someone opt in? And like, well, today, if you're, for example, a Spanish speaker, the only language you get the product in is in English. So if you can start to get more and more and more of the product in Spanish and you want to opt into a beta, like maybe you would do that. And it's just like, wow, such a different way of thinking about things. So on the cross-cutting initiatives, I think this is one where we've really tried to focus on like how do you take those cross-cutting initiatives, chop them up, and solve them kind of in a individual basis. We'll actually go through one of these examples in a second. The second one is providing kind of technological and design consistency. So if you have 40, 50 different teams who are all autonomously building product, well, how do you not result in a Franken machine? How do you not have 40 different teams all creating their own ways of building product? This is one where half of this problem I don't really think we have, and half of this problem we have a ton of and we've had to invest in. On the technical consistency side, we don't really have the problem where tons of different teams are going in totally different directions. Actually, I'm not even sure I can explain why that is. I think we wind up having just horizontal communities, and so our Java developers on one team are talking with our Java developers on other teams. Teams are reviewing each other's PRs. We have enough kind of internal mobility that people are moving between teams, and so, you know, as a person moves from one team to another, they're helping to create this kind of consistency about how we think things. So on the technical consistency, we haven't really had a lot of challenges there. The one that we have really struggled on is the design consistency. And I'm actually going to take you through that in a second. So one of the new evolutions that we've really started to talk about internally is how do we design internally about building for our platform. We've internally call this platform thinking. So how do we change from being kind of an app company to thinking about platform? I'm going to walk you through two examples of this, one of which really gets at the UI consistency problem. So let's take you back a couple of years. If you go back about 2 years ago and imagine how our product team was working, we had, again, let's just use the number 30 product teams at the time, all working independently. So we had the blog team and the social team and the email team, each working on their own area of the product. And if you were a new designer, let's say you got hired tomorrow in as a designer, and your job was to build out a new feature for the product. You're on the social team, and your job is to go build a new feature. The first thing you had to do is figure out, like, what should this page look like? What colors should I use on this page? What fonts should I use on this page? How should I lay out this page? What should a button look like? What should a drop-down look like? If I need a date picker, what should that date picker look like? And what we found is that there were no answers to these questions. Instead, you just kind of had different teams figuring it out themselves. Now, obviously, it wasn't like they were creating wildly different things. What they would do is they'd go find someone else who had a similar problem, and they're like, hey, how did you solve this problem? Oh, like I created this date picker, and like you can use my date picker. So they basically created consistency through tons of copy and paste and a lot of organic, just kind of like talking with one another, which is actually how like lots of HubSpot works. From our customers, though, what they saw was a bit of a Franken monster. Our customers would talk to us and they'd say, your product feels like it was built by 40 different people. And we're like, well, that's kind of because it is. And we were like, well, how do you solve this? How do you solve this problem in a world that's designed for autonomy, in a world in which we want those teams to be able to have autonomy? How do you solve this? So about 2 years ago, we set out to create what we now call Canvas. So if you want to, you can go to canvas.hubspot.com. Everything I'm going to show here is publicly available. You can play around with this. We're in the process of actually open sourcing some of this content as well. So what is Canvas? The first thing we did is our designers went through and they literally did an inventory of every single page in the entire application. Actually, more than that. They did an inventory of every single UI element on every single page. And so they started to come up with, well, we've got all of these sorts of things, like you have buttons and you have controls and you have drop-downs and you have date pickers and you have modals and stuff like that. And They literally just started to create an inventory of like, here's all of the different ways that buttons might look. Here's all of the different ways that date pickers might look, etc. And then the design team started to basically pick winners and losers. And they said, this is how a button will look. Oh, by the way, this is what the edges should look like. We're going to have this style of rounding. We're going to have this color gradient. We're going to have, this is how the contrast should work. Oh, by the way, this is what it should look like when you're not hovering over it. This is what it should look like when you're hovering over this. When you should look like when you're depressing this. They kind of standardize on all of that. This is what a modal should look like. So we went through and created this catalog. So you can go back here. You can see like every single one of these is like whole pages of items that we want to kind of standardize on. So I'm going to show you, for example, I'll talk through this a little bit. You don't need to kind of go into the details, but this is actually one of our designers. What we did is we took all of those things, and then we made them essentially sketch components. So now as a designer, I go in, and I'm like, okay, I need to create this new app. Well, what's my app going to have on? I probably am going to have a table there. A lot of pages on our app have a table. The table needs some sort of a header there. I probably need to have a couple of rows in that table. Maybe at the bottom, this is probably going to have a lot of rows, and so I probably need the ability to, have a pager here, a paginator here. People probably need to be able to search through this as well, so I probably need to have some sort of like a search widget up there, and then probably like a little bit of text here about the what they're able to do here, maybe some icons. So our designer just designed that entire page using a bunch of these components that we created for them in Sketch. What was our designer not doing? They weren't thinking about all those questions they had to think about before. They weren't thinking about exactly the rounded edges, what this should look like, what style this should look like, what the shape of that was, what the size of that was. They were focusing on what should this app look like from our customer's perspective, focusing really on the business problem. From our customer's perspective, what's really valuable is now if we have a team of designers and they're all using those same components, now when our customer goes from page A to page B to page C, there's a lot of consistency there from a kind of a visual perspective. But we weren't done. That would have just solved a piece of the problem. The second piece of the problem that we wanted to solve for was the developers. So we could have done everything I just showed you and stopped. We don't want cut and paste code all over the place. We don't want to have different developers having to figure out, well, how am I going to implement that button or how am I going to implement that table? So what we did is we set out and we took all of those different components that I just talked about and we created React components out of them. So now, just like our designer has essentially Lego blocks that they can use inside of Sketch, our developers have Lego blocks that they can use when they're coding. So going back to this page, so right next to this page is actually, here's the coding example that you would use if you wanted to create those elements there. Here's the coding example that you'd use if you want to create those elements here. So I'm going to show you version 2 of this video. Basically, imagine the designer created that thing in Sketch, and now your front-end engineer is going to create that. What we have over here on the right-hand side is basically a working editor. So it's a functional editor where the engineer can go and type in code over here, and then you're seeing the preview over on the right-hand side. So the engineer is going through and saying, hey, I need to go create that thing that my designer just mocked up. Well, I'm going to go and I'm going to create a table. So again, the table probably has a header at the header. The table has some rows. The table has a paginator. The table also needs to have search at the top. You can watch them as they are writing. This is live code. This is actually functional code that they could actually take, cut and paste. They are just implementing the UI right now. The great news is, again, what does this mean for developers? It means that the developer isn't having to go back and forth with their designer and figure out, like, is this exactly what you wanted it to look like? It means that, again, going between two pieces of our code, not only does the customer experience look great, but from a developer, I'm not having to think about exactly how I want to manifest the, what does a push button, what does a button look like when it's pushed, and what is the interaction style, interaction pattern like that. So this is an example of something that we spent probably 2 years investing in to allow us to solve for the fact that our organizational structure doesn't do well with cross-cutting initiatives. It doesn't do well with cross-cutting consistency. It's a place we have to put in a lot of energy. And now that we've done this, it's really great. More and more teams, as they're developing new pages, we've had more and more devs come up and say, I've been working on this project now for a month, and I've written 2 lines of CSS. Because they don't think about it anymore. All the CSS is buried inside of this, and it's maybe just like a little tweak here that they have to focus on. So the second thing, kind of the second case study I want to talk about, and this is an analogy that we've been trying to use internally, and hang on with me for a second because it's a little bit crazy. So we've been starting to talk about internally the taco stand model of product development. And we're like, what the heck is the taco stand model of product development? And it starts with this observation that if you go to your local taco stand, I can't remember, what's the name of the one that all the people here love? Boojum, yes, all of our developers are insane about Boojum. So if you go to a place like Boojum and you look in their back room, you went behind and you're like, how are they making everything? Probably looks a lot like this. You've got rice and beans, you've got your proteins, you've got a bunch of different ingredients, sour cream, some guacamole, salsa, stuff like that. And then the really key things, so you have these taco shells, you have the flour tortillas, you have the chips over here. And the really interesting thing is that with this palette right here, I can take one of these things, fill it with those things, and I just created a product called a taco. I can take one of these things and fill it with those things, and now I've created either a soft taco, or if I fold it differently, I might have created a burrito, or if I put the right things into it, I might have just created a fajita. I can take these things and put some of this stuff on top of it, and I just created nachos. So you have 4 different products that I just created with a ton of common ingredients. This is how we're really trying to think about how we build product internally. For us, our products are our top. We haven't gotten agreement as to which are which, but I'm going to loosely say this. Our marketing product is our tacos, and our nachos is our sales product, and our fajitas is our new customer service product. Do you want to be the customer service product? Everybody wants to be the guacamole. We know that. So we started to think about those are the products that we create. So what are the rice and beans? It used to be, 2 years ago, that we only had one piece in our product that did reporting. It was called the marketing product. We only had one piece in our product that had automation. That was the marketing product. We now want to have reporting across the entire product. The bad way of doing that would be to have every team go cook up their own rice and beans. We don't want 3 different reporting solutions. We want one reporting solution. It used to be that automation was only in one place. We want automation in every piece of our product. Sales needs automation. Customer service needs automation. Marketing certainly needs automation. We don't want teams to go cook up their own rice and beans. We want automation to be a platform. We want automation to be something that can be shared across the entire product. So a lot like what I just showed you with Canvas, we are in the early days of starting to go and invest in what's our internal product platform? What are all of those different tools that we're going to build all of the rest of the product on top of? What are the rice and beans? And it really changes how we think about building products. So we're in the process right now of building out our 3rd product line, the fajitas. And if you talk, and it's being built out of Dublin, so if you talk to any of our engineers here who are working on that, what they'll say is that it's totally changed how quickly they can get to market. Because they're not having to create this, they're not having to create this. It's possible, I should have used nachos, because it's possible they didn't have that before. So maybe what they're creating is the cheesy sauce. But everything else they get to borrow from what other teams have already created. And it's allowing them to move really quickly, get to market really quickly, to build a tremendous amount of functionality easily. And better than that, it's perfect for our customers. Because our customers, when they go into the marketing product and they use the reporting tool, and then they go over to the customer service product and use the reporting tool, it's the same thing. And so from our customer's perspective, it's like, wow, like it almost feels like this was created by the same people, not by 40 different teams. So this is kind of a second use case where we're putting a lot of energy into solving for really the natural weakness of our ecosystem. How do you solve for our autonomy does not foster consistency across the product. The way you create consistency across the product is by putting a lot of energy and a lot of resources into it, creating those platforms, creating Canvas, and then all of a sudden you can now have both speed and consistency at the same time. So that's really my presentation. Wanted to open up to the floor. Hopefully I've created a lot of questions for you and lots for you to noodle on. Mike, who's going to be the first brave soul?
How many engineers did you have when you decided that you would have to write that reusable UI framework? You said it took 2 years. So.
Yeah.
When did the pain point get so much that you said, we got to invest 2 years of our lives to do this?
Let's say...
No, it's going to take 2 years.
Yeah.
Well, it's software, so.
Yeah,
always
so let's
takes
say
place.
we were 250 people in product when we said, and again, I don't think it's a function of the size of the company. I think it's the size of the company plus the autonomy. It was really, it's the fact that we had however many teams, let's call it 25 different teams, each of whom were creating their own. If you had a company that was organized differently, if you had more top-down decisions, we probably wouldn't have had to do that. But in our world with autonomy, that's what caused the pain.
All right, that's fair enough. So it's a scaling thing where it was decided from the bottom up, which is the right way to decide these things. If it was top down, it never would have happened because no one would have to do it.
Yeah.
So that would have been, and I mean, there's a team of what, it wasn't a project in its own right. It's something that grew from various contributions.
No, this really was a kind of a core team. I'm trying to think of, Gabriella can kind of help me here. Like over that period of time, I'm guessing you're dedicated, you probably had 5 or 6 people who were spending enormous amounts of time on it. There's a lot of peripheral involvement, so every single team had to have their designer had to be involved at a point. But building out, so there was a core team of 3-ish designers who were basically building out the first set of slides I showed you. And then there was a team of 3-ish engineers who reactified all of that. And then really part of the hard part was and every app then migrated over to that. And so every team wound up getting impacted there. But really the core team was 6-ish people.
Yeah, and you just get buy-in from everybody else, obviously, because it makes everybody's life a little bit easier.
What was that?
It gets buy-in from everybody quite straightforwardly because it makes their life easier.
Yeah.
Can I ask you another question? You have a Mesos layer. Who put in the Mesos layer? That's the Mesos layer over AWS.
Yeah.
Who put that in?
That was our head of platform infrastructure who came up with the idea. And I'll actually tell you how we got buy-in for everybody to move to that, because it actually kind of, again, goes to some of the fun culture stuff. So we had if you go back about 4 years ago, we had debated whether we should be in a data center or be in AWS. We had actually tried to move to Rackspace and failed. And on the day that we failed to move to Rackspace, our head of our platform infrastructure team said, I want to go implement Mesos on top of our entire system because I want to get to the point, really he saw it as this is how we'll actually make the Rackspace move successful. We'll create Mesos on top of AWS, the teams will be completely abstracted away from it, then you can actually do a data center migration without the teams being impacted. Spent probably 2 years again working on that project, laying it out in QA, getting everything working in QA. And we got to the point where we had everything running in QA, we were starting the migration in prod, and again, one of our challenges is like, how do you get teams to do things? We had 15% of the team moved over into production, and we were just like, hey guys, like, move over. How many of you have used Amazon heavily? How many of you have used Amazon for, like, say, 3 or 4 years? Okay. You may remember this day. So I think it was about 3 years ago. If I remember correctly, Amazon found a firmware bug in their hard drives, if I remember correctly. I can't remember if it's a security hole or what it was. And they wound up having to patch their entire fleet. Every single machine in Amazon had to get rebooted. So Amazon called us up one day and said, hey, just letting you know that all 2,000 of your servers are getting rebooted. Like, that's all of our production infrastructure. And so we were at the point right then when we had basically 15% of our teams on Mesos in production. So our head of platform infra was able to go out to the dev teams and say, you've got 2 choices. Your machine's being rebooted. If you move on to Mesos tomorrow, you won't know when your machine gets rebooted, because what we'll do is we'll move over. Basically, what you had to do is you had to provision a new machine that was already patched and then decommission the old machine. If you move over to Mesos, we'll handle that for you, and you won't have to deal with it. If you don't move over to Mesos, it's your problem. We got like 70% of the team to move over in about 24 hours. So thank you for Amazon for that. It really helped us out. So that's like just an example of the kind of organizational dynamics of how do you like get people to move over to these things.
You can't plan for force majeure like that often. Yeah, thanks very much. So there's a platform infrastructure team that's separate to your organization then, is there? Or is it part of your organization?
It's the 20% of people that I was talking about.
Right, okay, gotcha. Yeah. Thanks.
Hi there. Couple of months ago, had this discussion, actually similar discussion with Barbara here, and one of the things that actually it sounds a bit strange is that I understand the autonomy in small teams, but how do you do massive changes like migrating from Singularity, let's say, to Mesos, or how the ideas are coming to these small teams? I mean, I can't believe that the guys are just sleeping at night and wake up in the morning with new ideas to implement or to try. So how this works?
Sure. So I'll use a couple of examples that, like very real world examples. And maybe I'll actually give two classes of examples that kind of are a little bit different. So I alluded to the Kafka example before. So let me go back in time. Rewind the clock about 3 years. One of our teams is our analytics team. Our analytics team, you can think of them as being like Google's tracker of how many website hits you have, like how many users are coming to your site, things like that. So they're processing massive amounts of data from our perspective. And one of the biggest challenges that they had from the customer's perspective is lag. How long is it from the time that I get a page load on my website to the time that you can report on it? And at the time, that was measured in hours. I don't remember 3, 4 hours, 6 hours, 12 hours. It was a relatively long period of time there. And the second biggest issue that they had was if they ever had to go recreate history. So if they wind up finding a bug in their code, if they wind up finding, like one of the things we might have is customers can implement IP exclusions. So, hey, I don't want to track these IPs. If a customer implemented an IP exclusion and then came back to us like 2 months later and said, whoops, I did the wrong thing and now I just like lost tons of my traffic. Going through and what we called rerunning the pipeline was a process that took extremely long periods of time, and it actually got to the point that we basically called it intractable. If I remember correctly, about 3 years ago, we did the last rerun of the pipeline, and I think it took 1 to 3 months. And it wasn't just the rerunning, it's the rerun fail, oh, go fix whatever causes fail, rerun fail, go fix whatever causes fail, and then like it took 3 months from the time we started to the time we ended. So as we were scaling, both of these problems are just getting worse, right? As you have more customers with more traffic, your lag gets worse. As you have more customers with more traffic, your ability to rerun gets harder and harder / impossible. And so that team, they knew that these were their biggest problems that they had. And at the time, the way that they essentially handled messaging, streaming data, was they used HBase for this. So they would dump a bunch of data in HBase, and then they would make an HBase query to aggregate the data and push it back in. Well, it turns out that HBase is really crappy at streaming data. And they kind of picked up their heads and said, well, we know what our customers' pains are. We know what we're trying to solve for. We want to decrease that lag. We want to make it really easy to rerun the pipeline. What can we do to solve that? And so they found Kafka. They started implementing that and said, hey, like this actually solves our problem very, very well. So they were able to go from lags of hours and hours to lags of minutes and seconds. And like I said, then they stood up in front of the rest of the engineering organization and said, hey, if you're solving problems like us, if you have a similar pain point that we do, here's a solution, here's how we used it, here's the interesting things that we did, like you can use it too. Over the course of, that was kind of like January through March or January through April is when they kind of Kafkaized their infrastructure. I would say over that summer, we went up having 3, 4, 5 other teams all say, hey, we've got that same problem, let's use that same technology. And I think it was kind of by the end of that year that we said, you know what, this is now becoming such a core component of our technology that we need to bring that into platform infrastructure, have somebody who's like a real expert at this, understand this, and help creating tooling for them. So that was an example on Kafka. Elasticsearch, I could use almost the exact same thing. So again, we store lots and lots of data in HBase. HBase is really slow to do real-time searches on. If a customer, that search box that we had in that UI, if a customer is trying to search there and you're searching over millions of rows, it's slow. And so one of the things one of our dev teams, it's really just one team came up with was, gosh, if you index a lot of that stuff in Elasticsearch, you've got the data in HBase and you index in Elasticsearch, well, all of a sudden you can do like real-time queries very, very fast. They implemented that and they stood up and talked about it. and then another team implemented it, and another team implemented it, and then you got to, again, to the point where it kind of became a critical mass. In both of those cases, it was very, very, very grassroots driven, nobody said you must do this. There's two other counter examples that I'll use. So we talked about the Mesos example. The Mesos example was a you must. Again, it's hard to do the you musts, and so you have to rely on people like Amazon to fail for you. The other one was actually the Canvas example that we talked about. Canvas was actually like a tricky one of teams wanted it. The teams, there's so much benefit that teams get from this. The customers get benefit from it. The teams get benefit from it. But it still was a you must. Like you have to get over to this. Probably the hardest thing is it wasn't moving to Canvas. It was a bunch of our teams were still on Backbone. And so it was actually, first you have to move over to React. And as you're moving over to React, you also have to do this thing. It was actually the Backbone to React move that I think was the hardest. And so like there was a lot of energy spent of the like, you must. You figure out the timeline, like you figure out like how this fits into the rest of your priorities, but you don't have an option of no. It's really it's a win, not no.
And who decides what percentage of each team is going to be spent in research and development in new things or dealing with the customer issues?
For the most part, the team does. So
by themselves.
Yeah. So basically, the product manager, the tech lead, and the designer are really looking at, they've got a bunch of incoming inputs. They've got customers who are yelling at them or want things. They've got support who's yelling at them or want things. They've got managers who are yelling at them. They're managers who are giving them gently feedback. And, and it's really up to the team to figure out that balance. And I think I certainly have the opinion, every one of our teams has a impossible problem of like they have way more things to do than resources to do it. So there isn't, going back to one of our first slides, there is no right answer here, and it's really up to the team to figure out like, great, like how are you going to balance all of these challenges? How are you going to balance new features and usability and reliability and performance and canvassing? And our belief is the people who are in the best position to navigate the way through those hard decisions the best is the team. And so we hand the team what we call the guardrails. Like these are the things you kind of sort of need to figure out how to do, and then let them figure out okay, I get it, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go first, I'm going to implement this feature, and then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do the Backbone to React port, and then I'm going to go focus on performance over here, and then I'm going to come back and do Canvas. And for the most part, like we trust them. Like great, like I can't second guess whether that's the right path to navigate through that. I know that you went and figured out what the right path is for your team.
And how do you manage conflict? Let's say if one team decides to do something, another 5 teams do exactly the same thing. Or try to solve the same problem.
So there's a little bit of this, which we're actually totally okay with. In our world, I would rather have teams be autonomous and move quickly and have some level of duplication than the opposite, than trying to create a system that prevents duplication. Now, when you wind up seeing, okay, like I actually now see, so I'll use a good example of this. So I mentioned a little bit ago that we have an automation feature in our marketing product. When our sales product was a baby product, you can basically think of this like a startup. This is a team that's just trying to get to market and find product market fit. They created a feature that is basically sales automation. It's basically kind of the same thing you do over in the marketing product, but for sales, creating a drip campaign for salespeople. One choice is they could have worked with the automation team to go basically build on top of the automation product. The other choice is run like heck, get something to market, and funk the decision of when you're going to write on top of the workflow product. Here we are 3 years later, we have a $30 million business on top of that sales product. And now we're talking about, hey, maybe it makes sense for us to move over to that automation platform. We could have done that 3 years ago, but it's a question of if that's just a premature optimization. So I think I'm willing to get to market, get that functionality out there, and if that means you've got these 2 code bases, like that's okay, we'll figure that out at some point in time, and then at some point we say, okay, now there's reasons why from an internal perspective or from a customer perspective it makes sense to merge these. Let's take care of that then rather than trying to prevent that in the first place.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say the primary thing that we use to really, there's probably two things that we use to figure out whether we met a customer's requirements. It's mostly feedback after the fact through a couple of forms. One is usage data. So we make it relatively easy for our teams to tag all sorts of things inside of their app and then measure usage of it. So if you just created a new feature, you probably went through and tagged it and are probably, or maybe even more interesting case is, let's say you have an existing feature and you're trying to switch it to a new model. What you might do is tag both the current version and the new version, do a split test, let some users use the new version, let some users use the old version, and then in your mind, you know you're trying to solve for something. Like I want people to be able to complete this task more regularly. Well, great, like measure and see whether they complete the task more regularly. If they don't, go back to the drawing board and don't release this out to everybody. If they do, then switch everybody over to it. So usage is definitely one of them. And then the second one, which this is something we're getting better at inside the app, is NPS, so customer happiness. So it's a very regular thing when a team is building a brand new feature in the product. As they're rolling it out, we do a lot of essentially gather customer feedback of how much did you like this application? Did it allow you to do what you want? And teams will absolutely make ship or no ship decisions based off that. Like it's a product internally we call tally. If you have a bad tally score, you're not going to ship it. You're not going to roll it out to everybody. You're going to spend a lot of time and be like, okay, why do I have a bad tally score? What is it about? What am I getting wrong that I need to fix? Let me fix that, get a new score, fix that, get a new score. Aha, okay, I figured it out, now roll it out. So I'd say those are kind of the two feedback mechanisms that we use.
So you mentioned loads of method or concept of organization like microservices, but having the teams so small and like very specialist on that thing, how do you avoid the work from getting boring?
So the question of how do we avoid the work from getting boring? So I would say the overall take I would say is two things, maybe two or three. I think one, there are always times that teams are going to have to go through a slog, and I think they recognize that. And I think there's, again, I think part of this actually comes back to this deep ownership issue. This is my area of the product, and I don't mean me, Eric, the VP. This is like me as an engineer on a team. This is my area of the product, and I look at it and I go like, it's slow, or it's buggy, or it's got bad usability. It's not Barbara telling me to go fix this. It's not Eric telling me to go fix this. It's me telling me to go fix this. It's me saying, you know, this is not serving my customer well. Therefore, we need to go do a slog. We need to go refactor this. We need to go do migration. And so I think the fact that it comes from within makes it so much easier for them to accept. It's like not someone telling me to do it. It's like me telling me to do it. Doesn't mean that it's still fun, but at least I can't blame anybody else. So I'd say that's one reason. I think another thing is most teams definitely try to do a mix of, you know, sexy stuff and not so sexy stuff. So whether that's building a new feature or really focusing on, you know, creating a much more user-friendly experience, like those I think tend to be very rewarding things. And doing a refactor, well, and some engineers love doing a refactor. So there's some engineers who are like totally excited by spending 6 months doing a refactor. But trying to balance those two. I think the third thing would be, I mentioned this before, we have a reasonable amount of internal mobility. So if you get to a point where a dev comes up to me and says, hey, you know what, I think I'm ready for something else. Awesome, let's figure out what project you'd be great on. There's not, like, we're not gonna, no, you must continue slogging forever. There have been relatively few times that we've had entire teams that for extended periods of time have had to do boring stuff. Yeah.
How long does that usually takes to learn the UI?
It's a great question. Did either of you use the Canvas? So the question was, how quickly does it take for a dev to learn Canvas?
I think we invested a lot of time in building really good documentation for it, and that's like exactly what you see in canvas.com. So the resources there are really good, and I don't know how long it actually takes to learn it, but I would say it doesn't take that long.
So Daria, what was it in your experience?
Yeah, I came from absolutely no React experience, starting like
Well, one of the things that we do is all of our new hires go through an onboarding project. It's basically I'll call it week-long, it's slightly shorter than a week-long, that by the end of that, you've gotten basic fluency in our build and deploy tools, all of our common backend components, all of our common front-end components. Like, you walk out of that and you can go to your desk on your team and be like, okay, I feel like I could do hello world right now. Like, I could go and do something functional there. That doesn't mean you've mastered the UI environment. And I think, some of the things that I think even today we are still trying to improve on is, when you have that ginormous list of things, it's like, well, how do I find the right one? So if you go and look at it, you'll see, like, it's not just you don't have one style of button. I think there's like 10 styles of buttons, and it's styles of buttons in this case and styles of buttons in this case. So knowing how to find the right one, that's actually a lot of the problems we're trying to focus on now, is how do you make it easier for developers and easier for designers to, I know I've got this gigantic toolbox, and now I need to figure out, well, which of these am I supposed to use? This is a very tricky question. This is one we've gone back and forth on. So the question was, are the teams full stack or are the teams single stack? This is one where I think there's enough pros and cons that we don't have any singular answer. The thing that we tend to try to solve for is this is one of the few cases where I would say solve for the developer. And what I mean by that is I'll construct a semi-artificial scenario that happens all the time. You've got a team of 3 engineers. You've got a tech lead and 2 devs. Your tech lead, let's make up, your tech lead is a strong back-end engineer. You're a full stack team. I've got 3 engineers. I have my tech lead who's back-end, I have 1 more back-end engineer, and I have 1 more front-end engineer. Like, with 3, it makes it really hard. Who is the front-end engineer gonna learn from? Who is the front-end engineer gonna become a great front-end engineer from? That's the challenge when you have a small full stack team, is there's no person for that person to become great from. The tech lead can help. I think they can help them become a better software engineer. They can kind of sort of like, yeah, that looks like good front-end code, but they're not gonna make them a great front-end engineer. And so I think for us, the question that we ask regularly is, are you doing right by the team? Let me make the problem slightly simpler. You have a tech lead who's back-end, you have a very strong senior front-end engineer, and you've got a back-end, a junior back-end person and a junior front-end person. Great, this is probably a relatively solvable problem. Like, have the senior person mentor the front-end, the junior front-end person, I have the tech lead mentor the junior back-end person, things are fine. So I think a little bit it's the how do you make sure that you're solving for each of the individuals. What we don't want to do is get to the point that you've kind of stunted someone's career of you've never been allowed them to become great. Even when we, what was that?
You don't specifically say we only hire. Some companies say we need
So,
somebody who has data.
yeah, actually, so the individuals on our team tend more often than not to be single stack. Not always, but tend. The teams are either full stack or single stack. So we will either have a team of a single stack team of single stack people, or we will have a full stack team of single stack people. I think our general philosophy is it's very hard to be a full stack expert. Like, how do you become a master of multiple things? Front end moves so fast. There's so many technologies coming through all the time. Like, it's very hard to master front end, let alone front end and back end. So we tend to lean, I'm not saying we don't, we certainly have people who lean both ways in terms of front end and back end, but most of the times it's like, okay, you're a front end person or you're a back end person, and the question is how do we set up the team structure around them? When we do a front end back end split, really the right way to think about it is it's still, from most perspectives, it's still a single team. So it's the single PM, it's a single designer, underneath which you have a back-end TL and a front-end TL who are working together. So rather than a triad, you've got whatever different people call it, for a quintet or whatever, of the 4 people working together. But really, from the PM's perspective, it's got a single mission, it's got a single goal. Sure, it happens to be that I've got some people focused on the front end and some people focused on the back end, but the PM, I don't think, really sees this as 2 different teams with 2 different missions when we do that split. But it's a point of great controversy. So test-driven development, I'll put that back in the category of We do not have any overarching process or philosophies here. There are absolutely individuals here who are passionate about test-driven development. There are absolutely individuals here who practice anti-test-driven development. and you kind of put them together and you let them fight it out. So the short answer is no, we don't. And then on a team level, it's very much up to the team. Again, going back to my slide, the team is responsible for the quality of their code. So however they wind up wanting to get there, that's up to them. When you say, what do you mean by shared code in that sense? So for them, like loosely, I'll say that teams don't share code. They share, team A owns the code and has a service. Team B consumes that service. So for the most part, we generally try to avoid Team A and Team B both working on the same code base. So if you are a consumer of my code, if you're a consumer of my service and my service isn't working, then complain to me about my service not working. Don't tell me how to develop my service. So we really try to, like, for the most part, when you have whatever it is, 4,000 deployable units, basically teams don't share code. We've broken it down to the point where teams own their own code bases, deploy their own code bases.
Tell a little bit more about ownership, because they're saying there's most of the multiple microservices are moving parts. And developers changing the teams, working on the next parts, next things are more polished.
Yep.
But you're still owning the past things.
Yep.
So what is like kind of life of those components of owning things? Like I know that
So I would say it is probably true that every team, especially like your description is a good one of any team that has been around for a long period of time. So we have some teams who are just working on greenfield projects. They don't have this problem. But if I'm a team and I'm working on an area of the product that's been around for a long period of time, like every team has certain areas of the product that they have to take care of, that they wish they didn't have to, they would love to not have to, but it's their product. And then they have the area of the product that they love and it's fun and it's exciting and they wish they could be spending all their time on that. But in the end of the day, like so I'll use an example. So all of the teams, our support team, if a customer calls in and has a problem, our support team logs a Jira. If a customer logs a Jira, the teams have to resolve it. Like you don't get discretion over the, well, I don't like that area of the code, it's a crappy area of the code. It's like, well, you own it. Like go fix the Jira. So I think for most teams, like it's, again, it goes back to a little bit of the question before. It's like it is what it is of the, like you don't get to not pay attention to the stuff you don't like. So I guess there's a piece of it which is like maybe at some point like you hit a inflection point, but we're growing as an organization maybe faster than the code rot is happening. And there's also a lot of, I mean, one of the things that teams will do, like at some point when an area of the product gets to a point it's so frustrating, they'll say, okay, you know what, we're going to go and we're going to completely refactor that. We're going to modernize it. We don't have, there's not a lot of code that I feel like has been sitting around and rotting for 4 or 5 years. At some point in time, it gets flipped. It gets moved over to our new server. What was that?
So you are splitting that functionality or that area of one team to different teams.
It could be. I mean, so there's.
Factoring by reassessing what we want to do there.
That could be the case. It could be. I mean, it could be the case that. I'll use an example. It's kind of the extreme example, but it's maybe one of the best examples. For going back to our website hosting platform, for a long time, it was the backend was written in Python. And all of the rest of our company is Java based on the back end. And we've developed tons and tons of tooling for the Java teams. And so over time, like the gap was just widening and widening and widening between, if I'm maintaining that Python system, I have so much less support. Whereas if I'm over here on the Java system, I have so much support. And so there's like a point where the teams are like, I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to bite the bullet. I'm going to take whatever time it is. I'm going to take the month. I'm going to take the 2 months. I'm going to rewrite this thing over into Java. I'm going to get rid of the old Python code, and now it's gone. And I think that's kind of how they think about that is, it's the, I got to do it. Again, you can't say no. It's really a, well, how am I going to fit this in with everything else? Great question. The general model, and this is, it varies, your mileage may vary, but in general, we tend to think about a PM over maybe 2 teams. So 1 PM per 2 teams, plus or minus. There definitely are PMs that have 1 team. There are PMs who have 3 or 4 teams. It also tends to vary with the seniority of the PM. Some of that tends to be how conceptually similar the areas are. Right? If you have 2, again, going back to the front and back end, I don't even consider that 2 teams from the product manager's perspective. If I have 2 teams that have probably the same persona with relatively closely aligned problems, it's probably easy for the product manager to think about those. If I have 2 different teams that have different personas solving different problems, it's like a really hard brain split for them. But so on average, call it 2 teams is probably the right average. It's a great question. I have no idea. This is so much how I don't even care about what the process is. I'm pretty sure the devs don't solve for the PMs. I'm pretty sure that.
I mean, the PM wouldn't be the person that would dictate what the document.
Yeah.
So if you've got 3 teams, you have to work with those other.
Yeah. And just to be clear, when I say there are no teams here that are using what, I would, in my last company, I was a preacher of Scrum, and so none of the teams here are doing hardcore Scrum. It's loose variations of, am I using Trello or am I using a Kanban view inside of GitHub that has swim lanes or lanes, but it's not, there's no kind of religious versions of it. And so I think from a product manager's view, it's great, tell me where I put my requirements. Do I put them over here or do I put them over here?
When we say PM, product manager as opposed to project manager, no project manager, which is the usual thing. So we're not obsessed about the process, we're obsessed about the product.
Let's say because, whatever it is. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe the problem is difficult,
Yeah.
and it's boring, and nobody wants to take it.
So there's a piece of your question I'm going to twist it a little bit because it isn't the choice as to which team is going to deal with it. So you have a customer. The customer has a problem with some area of our product. It's very clear then which team owns that. What could certainly happen, in your case, your description is a good one, is let's hypothetically, and I'm just trying to think of an interesting one. It could be a couple of cases. One, it could be that this customer is asking for something that no other customers are asking for. We don't have to do what that customer is asking for. You go back to my comment about solving for small and medium-sized businesses. One of the blessings of having 30,000 small and medium-sized businesses is there is no single customer who can come to us and say, build this feature or we're churning and we're going to change our roadmap. And it's just okay, if you're the only one who's asking for it, I'm not going to build it. If the market wants it, I'll build it, but if you want it, I'm not going to build it. And so if it's that, then it's really, I would say it's mostly up to the PM there to say, hey, that's not a use case we're solving for. Probably a more insidious example is something that we absolutely want to do, but is really hard. It's going to take months and months and months of refactoring. I mean, again, it's very clear who owns that. The team owns that. And it is not unheard of for customers to tweet at our CEO. Hey, Brian, why hasn't your team fixed the following thing? And what Brian does is he takes that tweet, he sends it across to me or my product peer and says, you guys on this? And we say, we got it. we understand the problem. We know, like, yes, we know what's going on here, and we are making the right decision for the business. That doesn't mean we're fixing it tomorrow. It could be this like a really freaking hard thing, and like we can go back to Brian and say, hey, Brian, this is a really freaking hard thing, and he's like, okay. So I think again, the team owns it. The team owns figuring out like how are they going to prioritize this, when are they going to get to it. It's very, very, very unusual for someone like exec like me or Barbara to get in a team's face and be like, why aren't you doing X? Maybe times like we're nudging them and asking questions and trying to push there, but like that in that scenario, the team owns it, and the question is, does the team have a good reason why they're not doing it? If the team has a good reason why they're not doing it, great. Like, I can't ask any more than that.
That's a customer one. It's very easy to
Yeah.
know a customer one. Someone one. A new piece of code, but
Sure.
don't know. Remember,
Yeah.
it's not live with that together.
Yeah.
But it was brought a code bug.
Yeah.
Completely stopped because of the code that one of the colleagues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have internally what we call a crit sit. So a crit sit is basically a bug that is a large enough bug that it causes like major customer impacting outages. So if there is a crit sit, again, it's pretty clear, at least at the top level, which team owns that. And crit sits, you take really, like, everything stops when a crit sit happens on that team. Like on that team, all hands on keyboard, trying to figure out what's going on, diagnosing that A to just like resolve the situation. And then B, after every crit sit, we do a post-mortem, and in the post-mortem, you understand like how did it happen? Did we have the right monitoring in place? Did we have the right prevention techniques in to prevent this? And through there, you might come into the like, I didn't cause this. Like, I don't know what the heck went on. And then you like dig underneath the covers and you're like, well, that team over there. And then essentially you'd hand the crit sit to that. So now they're like, we wind up having action items in the crit sit, which is like, go solve this underlying thing. Hey, team over there, you caused a crit sit on me. And this is actually probably one of the places where we do wind up getting a little involved, which is one of our jobs is to periodically nag teams around the, hey, how's it going with those crit sit remediation items that I see you haven't fixed for the last 2 weeks? Hey. And most of the time what happens is you get, oh, and they go and fix it. Sometimes what they come back with is, that's freaking hard. Like, we're working on it, ask us again in 6 months. Okay, great.
Full visibility and transparency about something like that. So, like, we have a Slack channel, so if it's occurs and actually there's an outage, like genuinely everybody is in that crypto channel. So you can see have you checked it, check the logs, I'm bringing the service back up, yeah, it doesn't stay. You can see all the chatter that goes on around it. So we're so transparent in how we communicate. It's not like there's been an outage, we don't really know what happened, but there's none of that. It's really transparent. And what I love about that actual channel is that everybody, even people that aren't actually involved in that particular piece of code or whatever, because it could be out of hours from either a Cambridge or Dublin, everybody will jump in to help. It's like, what can I do? Okay, can you check these logs? Can you do that? Can you update the announcements to customers? And everybody's so supportive and trying to do the right thing by the customer, getting it back up and running, and then actually doing the review after. Okay, how can we?
Because the way it isolate budget, whatever there is some kind of even weak hierarchy.
So
Some kind of
there's a term that we use internally, which is we use the word guardrails. So guardrails are like, if you cause a crit sit, like you fix the crit sit. Like this is non-negotiable. You can figure out like lots of other things, but there's certain things that you don't get to choose. Like it certainly isn't. Teams are not unaccountable. So if they have unhappy customers, then we're going to ask them like, hey, why the heck do you have unhappy customers? If they have a buggy area of the product, hey, why the heck do you have a buggy area of the product? It's what they have is the autonomy to figure out how they're going to address those things. If their answers are wrong, or like this happens so infrequently, but like if you have a team that's just like, woo, this is fun, I'm going to break things right in that. Well, absolutely, that's our job to be like, this is a problem. Like we will manage you and manage you out if we need to. The autonomy, though, is it's their responsibility to figure out how to deal with this. Yeah. Cool.
Last question?
Sure.
Yeah? Anything? All right. Then thank you so much.
Cool. So I think we're going to head down.